I'm Phil Beatty. I'm the Chief Knowledge Officer at Times Higher Education. I'm pleased to be chairing today, but I'm absolutely very much in listening mode. This is about facilitating a really important dialogue. The session today is tomorrow's science, technology and business breakthroughs, why global R&D collaboration remains vital for the UK. Obviously, it's a really, really big day today. We've got some awful geopolitical worries and of course some extraordinary humanitarian worries as well in terms of the Ukraine. It's a big worrying distraction. And we've also got a really important set of policy announcements for higher education from the Augur response that's coming in today. And that obviously has huge implications, I think, for access to higher education, but also for overall graduate numbers and the talent pipeline. And it's not the main focus of today to talk about Augur and students, but I think it is something we could feed into the conversation around the talent pipeline. I know NCUB has just issued a statement saying they're deeply worried about potentially harming the UK's economy by restricting social mobility, restricting overall student numbers. So we can explore that. But I think the real focus today and why we've selected such a great group of people is to really explore the idea of UK as a science superpower. I personally think the data suggests the UK already is a science superpower, certainly in terms of the research-led world rankings. We are holding our own reasonably well. We're certainly punching above our weight, but there's a clear, I think, a bit of a global leveling up taking place. We've seen, of course, the rise of China, but we have observed quite an interesting sort of tipping of the balance more from the west to the east, not just China, but also the Middle East as well. Seeing some real surging research performances. But I think we want to scrutinize that goal in terms of the immediate challenges to the goal, the opportunities for Britain to secure that status, and also that wider sense of, what is global Britain? How do we actually realize that as a higher education and research community? I think one thing that's really clear to me is that we can't hit the ambitious R&D spending targets without a really, really heavy contribution from the private sector. And I think it'll absolutely be impossible to hit those numbers without really rich and deep research collaborations between universities and industry, a UK industry, and of course overseas industry. So I'm absolutely delighted that this discussion is supported by Huawei, which of course has a wide range of successful and innovative collaborations with universities in the UK and beyond. So I'm really looking forward to perhaps exploring some specific case studies and examples of really positive partnerships today. Other talking points I'd hoped perhaps we can touch upon, although I will let you dictate where we go. Increased research spending, I think, must be matched by better freedom of movement. We need to talk about the immigration regime, the talent regime. We need, obviously, particularly with this group, to talk about a more even distribution of research funding and how universities can really support the leveling up agenda. And I think also red tape is a big issue. We've got some regulatory changes that I think would be really helpful to explore. But I do want to make sure you help shape the debate. So perhaps if we could start, I'm so pleased we've got such a strong range of experts here. But if we could start maybe by just very quickly introducing ourselves so everyone's very clear who's in the room, and you just say who you are, but also perhaps one or two lines briefly about what you'd like to put on the agenda for today to make sure we cover it. So if we could go around the room, Matt, you've got your camera off, but Matt Jackson from Huawei's here. He wanted to say a quick hello.
Hi everybody. I'm very much on listening mode here. I know some of you and lots of familiar faces. So nice to see you all again. For those of you who don't know me, I work in academic relations and I work with THE, specifically Charlotte and Phil, to produce these series events. And we're here to learn, to see how Huawei can help with these issues. So I'm going to turn my screen off and listen to the conversation. But nice to meet you all.
Excellent. If I just go around the group from to my right, that's Dave Robertson. Could you say quickly?
Dave Robertson. I'm an informatician by training from Edinburgh. I'm currently heading College of Science and Engineering there. So I suppose my interests are just to talk about how science has changed internationally. I think a lot of what we're seeing now that's relevant to this sort of international question is to do with the way that science fundamentally has changed. So maybe we could talk a little bit about that.
Thanks very much. Luke? Oh, sorry, Luke, the classic Zoom link that you're on mute. Thanks.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Luke Georgiou. I'm Deputy President at the University of Manchester, where I'm responsible for innovation and for international matters. I guess from this meeting, I'd like to see some discussion about how global cooperation in research is affected by the current geopolitical environment.
Thank you very much indeed. Yeah, that's an incredibly important topic, particularly also with Huawei is in the conversation as well around some of those geopolitical issues. Mohammed?
Hello, hi everyone. I'm Mohammed Imran. I'm a professor of communication systems at James Watt School of Engineering in University of Glasgow. I'm also Dean for University of Glasgow's collaboration with a leading Chinese university, UESTC. And I think what I want to bring to the table is discussions on how our higher education sector engagement in transnational education can be strengthened and supported by leveling up agenda, by allowing flow of expertise, as well as engagement of research globally.
Excellent. Thank you very much for joining us. And Marion?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I'm Marvin Campbell. I'm Vice Principal, Pro-Vice Chancellor for Research at the University of Aberdeen. And I guess the types of things that are, I guess, on top of my agenda at the moment is, you know, how to ensure continuing ease of global collaboration, especially in the light of, you know, different regulatory, I guess, systems, and ensuring that we keep research moving. And I think, you know, you also mentioned, Phil, the issue about global talent and ensuring, you know, good flow of academics ongoing, because, you know, can't do good research without good talent.
Thanks, Mariam. Thank you. And Michael, do you want to introduce yourself as well?
Yeah, good morning, Phil. Good morning, everybody else. I am Michael Hill-King. My job in Huawei, as I guess some will know, is really to look after our external research partnerships and try to make things happen as smoothly as possibly for everybody, and to manage the bumps in the road. But my observation is that the bumps in the road are no longer bumps; they are trenches and mountains. And this may or may not be the intention of the policymakers. So I really like to hear the responses to other people, because this affects our attractiveness in the UK to both people to study here and to do research here.
Thank you very much. And Simon, welcome to you as well.
Hi, I'm Simon Hetrick from the Software Sustainability Institute based at the University of Southampton. So my interest really lies in skills and making sure that we have the right skills for conducting modern research. And that focuses entirely on non-traditional research roles. So the research software engineers and the data managers and the technicians and all these other roles that underpin all of the research that's going on. And I want to see those roles recognized, and to do that, we're trying to change the way that research is evaluated. So that's where my interest lies.
Thanks very much for joining us. And Louise.
Hi everyone, I'm Louise Bates. So I head up the strategic partnerships team within the business engagement and knowledge exchange group at the University of Manchester, so work very closely with Luke. We manage the institutional level relationships, very much focused usually around research as well as skills and recruitment. So my focus really is that best practice sharing on how we can engage research with the larger companies and the global companies, and making sure that we can continue to build those relationships and broaden them out with additional partners.
Excellent, thank you. And I'm really keen to get into that best practice aspect. I think one of the benefits of a group like this is trying to make sure we share experience of how to make it work successfully, how to overcome the trenches and the mountains that Michael mentioned. So just to be clear, obviously this is a closed group, but we are planning, it's obviously being recorded. Times Higher is planning to report on the outcome of this. So there will be a write-up on Times Higher. So we do plan to quote you and name you. So if you did want to move off the record, just to talk frankly about any particular issue, just say this bit's off the record, because I want to have an open conversation, but of course we want to make sure we're sharing the fruits of this conversation to our wider audience. So if anyone wants to go off record, just say so. But otherwise, let's assume it's on record, because we want to share the ideas. I just wondered if I could kind of try and set the scene a little bit by asking, picking on one of you, maybe I don't know, I'd go to perhaps you, Luke, just to sort of think, University of Manchester, highly ranked, et cetera, is Britain a science superpower, and what do you think the ingredients are to either get there or protect the fact that we're already there? What's your view of that, and what are these core ingredients I think we need as a nation in terms of the policy environment, particularly in terms of R&D and university industry collaborations? How do we, what are the ingredients we got, and what are the ingredients we need to add to the mix? Sorry, it's a long question, but you know what I'm
there's a few questions in there. Yeah, well, I think as you already said, I mean, by any measure, we would count as a science superpower, given the share of the world's outputs, and particularly the better quality ones, as measured in various ways, and given the quality of our universities as reflected in your own rankings and others. So I don't think we need to debate too much there. It's really what we do with that. I mean, how we are able to bring that scientific standing to bear in dealing with the economic and societal challenges that we're facing. And that's what then takes us into areas already referred to by others, such as the levelling up debate, for example, and engagement with industry. I mean, no country, however huge, even the US or China, the two massive scale countries in terms of scientific output, can afford to work without international cooperation. We can see in the statistics how interdependent scientific publication is nowadays, and the projects that underpin that. So we have to be ready and willing to engage. There isn't a version of science where you can put up the walls and operate on your own.
Yeah. I was going to ask anyone else, are there any areas, do you think, in UK science where we are sort of self-sufficient, or is that almost it's not even a valid suggestion anymore that we could be sort of nationally self-sufficient in a particular field? It's advancement comes only through collaboration. Obviously, there are clear areas in parts of the world where other countries have a lead, and I do note Joe Johnson's recent report on this with the Harvard Kennedy School and King's College London did note there's areas where China in particular is much stronger than the UK in terms of elements of AI in particular, and we'd be really at a loss if we weren't collaborating with the very best in the world. So it's not a question of should we, it's a question of how do we manage it. But are there any areas where we might be considered self-sufficient, or is it literally a case that there's no great science happens without us collaborating globally? Any thoughts there from the group?
I think you don't get to choose nowadays. That's the point. So back in the good old days when I were a young lad, if you were a university, you could build up your library. I was an AI person. We had a self-sufficient AI library. We had all the books anybody could ever want in AI. This has been 35 years back. And you could defend that, and it could be an asset to you. Think about what that's like now. It's completely impossible to do anything like that, even if you wanted to. So we could play a game where we tried to guess particular niches where we could try and fend off the world, but we wouldn't last for very long because science just isn't like that anymore. It's just completely changed foundation.
And I think that's interesting, isn't it? The sort of fundamental nature of science itself is that it's inherently this great global set of collaborations, this huge matrix. Mariam, I see you have your hand up. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I was just going to comment on that, and I can't remember who mentioned it at the start, but I think the purpose of most universities now is to address these large, intractable global problems. So I think, for all of us in the university sector, we are looking at the global field for all the science that we do. So I think it would be very naive of us to think that we were totally self-sufficient in any one part of science anymore, because the world itself is much more interconnected, and therefore the problems that it faces is global. So I think certainly from our university's point of view, I think it would be probably quite limiting to think that we had answered it all or were self-sufficient within the UK.
Sure. Mohammed, do you want to come in?
Yes, and I think even pandemic is a great example, which has shown us that if we're trying to solve any problem, if we try to solve it only in our own region or in our own location, that will never be solved. So we are in a global village, and any problem anywhere has to be tackled by a global consortium, global effort. Of course, I do understand the desire of certain countries and nations of having development of some technologies secret or maybe more isolated or siloed, but fundamental science and fundamental solutions should be developed jointly.
I think it's a really interesting one, because the way Boris Johnson framed the sort of 5G conversations in terms of the national security issues, I think he framed it almost in terms of the fact that the UK had lost so much ground in that area that it's a warning shot, because they had to then retreat, and then they got stuck into some really unpleasant infrastructural problems that set them back several years. So that idea that the strategy now, the industrial strategy and the science policy that would try and pick core areas where we would take a lead, but even that we could never ever be in isolation. Simon, come in, but I would like to try and move this towards now saying, look, I think there's an agreement that science is inherently now global. There are no national challenges really. We're all interlinked. I'd like to move towards some of the red tape and the practical challenges of making sure we retain that. But Simon, do come in. I know you've had your hand up for a little while.
So similar to Dave, I have a background in software, and so I feel that we have this we've had this advanced sort of view into the future, because our research you can do anywhere as long as you have access to a desktop or a laptop. So we've been working globally for decades quite easily, whereas more instrument-led science, you have to actually meet up in person around an instrument at some stage. So, and what we found is as soon as you open that way of collaboration, there can be no going back, because you're building upon layers and layers and layers of work which has had global contributions to it over decades. It's incredibly powerful because you can draw on all of that expertise, but you certainly could never then cut yourself off and have this speciality for yourself.
Thank you. I'd like to push into the two areas there around the practicalities, and maybe Louise, I'd love to come to you in a moment or two around some of the practical examples. But Luke, you have your hand up. I wondered if, obviously, as well as the comment you were planning to make, I could press you a little bit around the regulatory environment. Well, actually, sorry, let's talk to you about the geopolitical environment that you mentioned, and then perhaps Louise could talk a bit more about the regulatory environment and some of the new conditions that are being applied around IP and the recent act of Parliament around intervening and potentially blocking certain IP arrangements. But Luke, what's the sense of a university as global and as prominent as Manchester? What's the sense that you have around the partnerships you have and geopolitics? I mean, obviously the immediate question for me would be what on earth happens to our scientific collaborations with Russia, for example, in the immediate term. But obviously China is a huge partner, an important partner, but of course we're stuck in a slightly tense geopolitical situation with China as well. What's your take on the importance of international collaboration? Is clear, but the actual practicalities of delivering it?
Well, I think there has been a tendency in recent years for several countries to become more aware, not only of the more obvious security implications of certain technologies, but also the economic or competitive advantage that goes with that. There have been trends like that before. There was one, you know, way back in the Reagan days in the USA, when there were quite strong attempts to restrict international technology flows. But we're even seeing, for example, the European Union is having extensive discussions about strategic autonomy or technology sovereignty, depending on who you're talking to. The idea that there are areas which are so critical that you need to ring fence them and restrict collaboration in those, and that's not purely on defence grounds, which I think we all accept that has to exist. And you know, there's been talk of excluding us, for example, from areas such as quantum technology in the Horizon Europe program. So it doesn't only work one way; it reflects on everyone. So there is definitely an atmosphere of this. I mean, clearly, Louise will talk about the detail of it, but we have to be sensitive to that. Naturally, before anything else, we have to make sure that we're compliant with both the legal framework and the spirit behind that legal framework. So then it's still trying to ensure that knowledge flows enough for it to be generated to everyone's benefit. And we have to be careful not to damage ourselves in that process.
Thanks. And Louise, I would like to come to you. Michael's got his hand up. So Michael, do you want to come in quickly, and then we'll talk to Louise about some of the practicals?
Well, I'll be super quick then, since you've pulled me in front of Louise, so I feel guilty. I think there's two separate things going on here, Phil, and I think we would do well to separate them to avoid some accidental conflation. On the one hand, we have the thing that we all agree, that science is global, but of course technology builds on science, and you can have probably more an opportunity for technology weakness than technology ownership in one particular country. And part of the whole process is trying to address areas where we may want to secure our own technology pipeline for the future, and we want to be prevented from developing certain technologies here in the UK, and we may want to develop some kind of productivity, which is something that's another subject where we're lacking a bit, based on those technologies in the UK. The other side, which should not be conflated at all in my view, is around transferring of, for example, military technologies to parts of the world where we wouldn't want to export arms. And that is something where there are controls already in place. There are more regulations around at the moment. And that is why I think part of the new regulations includes a consideration of, for example, asset and intellectual property control, which previous regulatory environments didn't take into consideration. So I think my point really is to say, well, I think there's two very different things going on here, and we should keep them separate.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's an interesting point around, as you're talking about military tech and IP, because I think one of the examples given last week, there was a HEPI report on the new National Security and Investment Act and some of the potential risks of sort of unforeseen red tape backlogs. There was things around, research that could potentially at some time have a military application. You might literally have somebody, I think there was an example given in the report, somebody studying insect swarms in an incredibly benign way, but at some stage down various lines that could have a military application around drone technology or nano technology of some description. So there's a huge gray area then, and maybe Louise, this is a good time to bring you in. I just wanted to A, talk about the regulatory regime in general, but B, maybe is there a concern as per this report by the Higher Education Policy Institute last week that the new National Security Investment Act that came into force in January, is there a slight sense that actually is potentially going to have unforeseen consequences, because there's things around the resourcing of the advisory body that looks at the cases, whether there's potentially a huge backlog, the grey areas. What's your sense of it from Manchester?
I think we're very aware of it. We put it at the forefront of our thoughts. I think it's going to take some time to play out to see what the impact really is. I think as long as we're very aware of it and we're open in our communication with our partners about the potential for us to need to have these conversations before we move forward with anything, then I think that's the main thing that we need to do in order to protect our relationships with our industrial partners as well. I think, yeah, it's going to take some time to play out. So in a way, I kind of want to see how things go. So I can't comment massively at the moment. We have had some examples where we have had to ask for some advice through our tech transfer organisation. So it has happened already. But at the same time, yeah, I think it's going to take some time to play out, but we've got all the systems and processes behind the scenes to do those due diligence checks to make sure that we're not doing anything that we shouldn't be. So I'm sorry, I can't give you a more concrete answer than that at the moment.
Yeah, and I guess that's part of the story, isn't it? That we've yet to see. There's just a sense that the sheer volume of questions, inquiries, or paused approaches, we just don't know yet. But I guess the concern was, yeah, we might have a few too many paused initiatives in a long queue. So what about the existing arrangements? I mean, what sort of could you give us a couple of examples of some of Manchester's sort of most exciting industry partnerships that have worked really well, or what sort of ingredients have you put in place to ensure the two cultures of academia and industry are in harmony?
Yeah, so again, I think the implementation of the team that I run has been really important for some of our large institutional level relationships. So it means that we have an account management model. So we have kind of a single point of contact for a company into the university that can really manage the relationship and understand what the company needs and almost preempt some of the research focus areas they might want to explore with the university. I think the other thing as well is just getting under the skin of the company and making those relationships. So that's something that's really, really helped. We have a list of 18 strategic partner companies, and they've grown. Pretty much all of them have grown from small collaborations, and we've nurtured them and broadened them out to be really institutional level. And what we mean by that is that they interact with different faculties within the university. It's not just one focus area. Some examples of our relationships are people like Rolls-Royce, Siemens, BAE Systems, GlaxoSmithKline, Unilever. So again, these large global partners. And again, we nurture them and we look after them and we want to make sure that we maintain them. So I would say a lot of them are research focused, but we also try and ensure that we allow them access to other areas of the university as well. So the student recruitment, getting them involved in teaching as well, so that we're supporting the skills development for those companies coming through too. And I think that's a really important part of the levelling up agenda as well, because we're seeing companies coming to the Greater Manchester region and wanting to set up locations, and therefore we want to ensure that they have that pipeline of talent coming through as well. Luke, I don't know if you want to kind of add to that too.
I think that's a good description of how it works, and we see it back in the data as well. I mean, for nearly all of those companies, we're at least in the top 5, and sometimes much better than that in terms of co-publications between them and universities. So it seems to work.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And Marion, you said at the beginning you were keen to discuss the regulatory environment. What's your sense of it now? Any concerns you have around sort of changing or increasing red tape?
Well, I think, you know, as has been mentioned, there is increasing amounts of red tape, and with the new act, and similarly, even before this, thinking about, you know, the transfer of you know, responsibility for due diligence onto universities from, say, you know, ODA type activities. So there has been an increasing shift, I think, across over to universities to ensure due diligence. And, you know, I think, you know, all universities have been, you know, operating, or, you know, the wheels have been turning very quickly to ensure that we have the capability and the support structures available internally to ensure that we can rapidly undertake these due diligence activities. And I think probably as universities, we all just need to to accelerate that activity, because if anything, it's going to increase. And I guess across the board, I guess some of the universities may not have been ready for this level of I guess responsibility on them to undertake that. And I think that's a moving agenda. So I think as a sector, we need to spend a lot more time concentrating, ensuring we've got the appropriate skills within our universities, not just to manage the research activity, but to manage the legal, the due diligence, and those activities. So, I was interested to hear about, across the sector, if there is that same sense of acceleration of pace and the introduction of probably a wider skill base than we've traditionally had within universities to deal with this type of activity.
Yeah, anyone else want to come in on that? Simon, you've got your hand raised.
So yeah, I think making sure that we have access, the researchers have access to skilled people who can answer these questions for them is absolutely fundamental. And we saw this with other regulatory changes, such as the Data Protection Act is a really good example. When that came in as the EU law, what happened was universities just clamped down because they didn't really have access to be able to understand what questions were being asked of them via the legislation. So they found it easier just to say no to things rather than to continue to work. So I think we might see the same thing happening here, where it's safer to say no, so we put limits on rather than actually investigating the law and allowing the things that can still happen to happen.
Does anyone else want to come into that? This idea, again, that Marion raised, and thanks, Simon, that the university, almost like a lot of the responsibilities being dumped on the universities, and whether they then, one of the responses might be that they're over cautious, or it all gets very centralized and it sort of slows down the pace of innovation. Luke, do you want to come in?
Yeah, I wouldn't use the word over cautious. We try to be appropriately cautious, but there's no hiding the fact that this is an expensive process. Having to spend a lot on dealing with this. It consumes money, it consumes time, it involves external contracts for due diligence work as well. And all of that is effort which is not being spent on research. So there is no doubt it's a considerable overhead.
And have you been increasing the investment as a result of the new legislative changes? Is that sense universities have, as Marion suggested, have to put increasing effort into this? It's expanding the staffing levels and the volumes of activity.
I think broadly the answer is yes. I mean, the timeline is that we were quite early in doing this, but certainly it has been a response. And just to pick up the point about researchers, that is absolutely critical. You can't solve this issue simply by having an expert central unit. You have to really get everyone engaged in it and have them understand both how they can work with your support unit and how they can manage their own relationships as well.
Absolutely. And Michael, it'd be great to hear from the other side of the fence here in terms of how you approach some of these partnerships and support that relationship in terms of regulatory minefields and hurdles.
Yeah, and we're as involved as anybody, I guess, in this. And it's absolutely right, just as Luke says, it costs money and it costs time, and there's a whole bunch of new skills that need to be brought in, as Simon highlights a moment ago. But what this means, and I think most universities, most big research universities, have built their internal capability and capacity, and they've upskilled and they've completely revamped their way of approaching the whole big picture of research governance in ways that were just non-existent half a decade ago. And I think now they are starting to experience how the system works, but it's going to be ages before, as Louise says, before we're going to get some good real understanding and case studies. And so in the next 6 months, we've got to somehow work together. And so there is coordination across some of the university groups. The guys that I kind of feel more for are some of the smaller universities that we work with who don't have the critical mass in research to justify having a team of specialists who can really understand all the new governance aspects that have come along. and they're the ones who are going to have more interaction with the RCAT and more interaction with the ISU, and they're the ones that could be slower to have to get through approvals. But I think one of the things we haven't mentioned so far and really ought to come out is we look at all this. If you stand back and take the helicopter view, so to speak, well, how does this look in terms of messaging from the UK to international partners in every country, in every sector? What do you think? If you're going to get, if it's easier to work with, for example, Germany, or Switzerland, you might just work with Germany or Switzerland because it might be less hassle. So we somehow need to convey that the UK is equally attractive, or at least attractive as it was before, because of the three elements in the growing as science superpower, to quote back some government. You need the government, you need the private investment, and you need the international. Well, one of those three pieces, perhaps the UK doesn't look quite as attractive as it should do at the moment, and that is entirely self-inflicted.
I think it did strike me, and you know, obviously, just to be absolutely clear, Huawei is supporting this conversation, and it's important that we work with Huawei. But I have to say, personally, I have found some of the rhetoric in the press about China and security fears has been, from my personal view, quite hysterical. If you look at some of the specific projects that have been highlighted as, you know, problematic, some of them are quite innocent, public domain, published outcome research projects. I remember there was a sort of think tank report that listed a whole range of university partnerships with not Huawei in particular, but lots of Chinese organizations with apparent military implications, and the distance between the pure open published research and the potential applications, you know, things like graphene and really basic technology. So I think there is a sort of a hysteria that's sort of emerged in some of the media coverage of this, in particular perhaps in some of the hawkish elements of government, that I guess does send out that message that is global Britain as global as it wants to be? Is it as open as it wants to be? So I'd welcome any thoughts about that. But Mohammed, I see you've patiently had your hand up there.
Thank you very much. So I just wanted to add that any good groundbreaking research comes through collaborations. Collaborations are already very tough to establish or initiate or start. Any additional barriers we put really repel people from trying hard to establish collaborations. So it's not just universities which are finding it more difficult to support their research teams. Large universities, for example, can afford it with dedicated teams. Smaller universities may struggle, but even more than that, individual academics have been scared a lot to initiate any risky collaborations. And there is lack of guidance, lack of clarity. To be honest, any technology can be put under dual use category if you stretch your imagination, right? So it's very difficult to really identify where I can collaborate and to what level. Even as Phil, you very rightly pointed out, even if we will be criticizing joint publications, right, where no technology transfer has happened, rather it has been like sharing of ideas and maybe repeating experiments on two parts of the world just to validate them or just to put weight in them. And then media criticizing that, oh, you're collaborating with risky partners. And I would also bring the transnational education into the fold as well. A lot of T&E activities more focused on educating people, widening our participation, exporting the UK brand back to other countries as well, and making it easier for students to access that education that many people can have here in UK. It has both philanthropic aspects, but it has a huge net zero ambition as well, because you're reducing so many people flying in and flying out every year just to get education here in UK. You're taking good education to their doorstep, right? So all those positive things are being undermined by, as I think Phil, you said, hawkish behavior in media and saying that anything that we do with the countries that they don't like is risky and it's negative. I think that has to change.
That's a really important point around that the risk of a sort of almost personal level self-censorship. If you're studying something, I think there's that issue, isn't it, when it's at the cutting edge of curiosity-based research, pure science. you can imagine all sorts of scenarios where there could be dual use or different outcomes. And I think there is that weird challenge around not allowing curiosity to be hampered and held back by a sort of second guessing, you know, whether it'll be in the times that there's some awful research that might one day be used by China to do something dubious. It's a really weird environment. I think we do have to try and work out how do we create safe spaces around the curiosity driven research that genuinely does give us those huge breakthroughs that can change the world. Dave, I've noticed you've been relatively quiet. I wondered if you wanted to reflect on anything or talk about any specific examples from your side around how you've made partnerships work in particular.
Yeah, okay. So maybe a general point, just to come back, Phil, to your science superpower thing. So the way I define a national science superpower these days would be that we were capable of really engaging with and making a difference to some of the big issues of our time. So it would be climate change, energy, biotechnology, aging and healthcare, all of these things that we all know are really important. And so then the question is, could we remain a science superpower if we were the size of Britain doing our own thing? Absolutely no chance in the world. The probability is zero because our science base is too small to do that. We have no chance of being a science superpower under that definition. And so the only route is the route that we've taken traditionally, actually, but I think we've possibly slightly forgotten, which is to be expansionist in our science. We're good at science because we absorb the best of science from everywhere else and then reflect it back into the world. That's what the UK has done for centuries. It's how we built our strength. So it's easy to forget that when you have a narrative that's quite negative and a little bit insular, to be frank. And so the insularity, I think, really is the enemy. The other thing that is actually new, and this relates to industry, I think, is quite often industry is the unifier and industry is the vehicle for getting science out into the world for these big questions. There's also zero chance of having an impact if all we do is generate public domain scientific results and then hope that that's enough. One of the things we've certainly learned at Edinburgh is the cycles are so tight now between a discovery that you make and your ability to get it out into the world in some useful way. Because of course, the commercial world, the industrial world, just the social world changes so rapidly now, you've got to move it fast. So you've got to have quite tight engagement with industry or you'll have no traction on these big problems. So I actually believe the future for universities that want to be involved in that, and actually it's not, you don't have to, as a university, you don't have to feel obliged to go full on and be involved in these sort of deeply immersive ways. Not every university will want to, not every university can, but if you do, then you have to have that sort of integrative structure, and it does cost you. So I suspect possibly that's a game in the end that only the larger universities play. And then you have another interesting question, which is how actually to do the science that's beyond that also necessary, because even the biggest universities in the UK are not big. And then of course, we're seeing a number of experiments play out in that. These are the kind of integrated networks and centers that the UK is building. And I think they're very interesting experiments, but they're still playing through. We still have to learn from what those might do, and crucially how those might involve industry as well as through the universities. But you've got me monologuing, Phil. I'll stop now.
Brilliant, thank you so much. Michael, I'll ask you just for maybe a couple of specific examples of where you've made things work. And I don't know even if you're, from, as the partner, on the partner side, the industrial partner side, whether you can actually almost support the regulatory elements in terms of providing a supportive environment from your side to help the universities get through some of the bureaucracy to make sure partnerships work. And then perhaps we'll use the last 10 minutes after that talking more about the talent and people. But Michael, do you want to just talk about some specific areas where you've had really successful collaborations and what do you think's made them work in terms of the getting across the hurdles and making sure we get through the regulatory processes?
Yeah, the regulatory process I'll probably comment on less because the rules changed, what, 7 weeks ago, and we're still learning them. And of course, we can only provide our experience and opinions. We can't provide any advice to any of our colleagues in universities, though we have some pretty deep conversations on our own projects to help each other. And it really is a case of helping each other, understanding what right path for something, or to just change what we're doing, so we do something that is easier to demonstrate compliance for. But as an example of a good collaboration, I think it's only fair to pick on Dave again, for thank him for his monologue, and say, well, if you search online and you look for the Huawei Edinburgh Joint Lab, you'll find a whole mini website devoted to our activity we have going on in Edinburgh, and you can read about the workshops we jointly have. You can read about the papers that are jointly published. You can read some of the internal competitions. You can read about some of the visiting scholars. You can read about some of the student activities. And there's probably more aspects that I've forgotten about. But all of this is up there online, and actually partly why it's there is a response to some of the existing regulatory environment. And a second example of this will probably be Andy Neely's blog that he stuck up from Cambridge a couple of months ago, and he said, hey, this is what we're doing with China. This is how much money we've taken from China, and how much money we've taken from Huawei over the last X years. And it's less than 1% of their research income. It's a lot more than 1% of the research income from China. In fact, probably most of it. But in terms of the overall research income, we're tiny. But obviously able to create impact and do useful things, because if we couldn't do useful things with the research we're funding, we wouldn't keep coming back. We wouldn't set up big long-term relationships.
I think it's obviously it's obviously coming from me as someone who was a journalist for 15 or so years, and still imagine I am a journalist to some extent. Openness and transparency just seems to be absolute key here. You know, universities' collaborations with Huawei, with Chinese organizations, with, you know, as long as we are clear about what the knowledge creation is, how it's benefiting society, you know, really visible about what we're doing, I think it's a really good way of sort of breaking down some of that sort of more inherent knee-jerk hostility. I mean, of course, we have to be careful about specific military and security issues. Of course, we're not suggesting we should have a complete free-for-all, but I think so much of the work, the more people understood it, the more it was in a really open environment, the more I think we provide reassurance that this is actually benefiting society in general, but also benefiting the UK in terms of scientific progress and economic progress. I just wondered if we've got about 10 minutes left. I would like to touch on maybe on Olga's response. I know it's literally just this morning, and it's perhaps not top of everyone's agenda right now because there's a reflective process here. But I did want to talk about talent in general, and I know, Simon, you did, and Mohammed, you did as well. Have we got the right ingredients in place in terms of international talent flow? Obviously, I think we've made huge strides from the sort of hostile environment that led to some student mobility hiccups. I think, you know, the international strategy for student recruitment is booming. It's very successful. But in terms of the next level researchers, highly talented people, have we got it right in terms of, you know, the academic technical approval schemes, the immigration environment? Anyone got any thoughts or comments on issues of concern there, or opportunities? Mohammed, Simon, did you want to come back in on those issues?
Yeah, I would just say it's not just the academic staff talent, researcher talent, but even the student flow. Good students coming here for higher education and then retaining them for retaining the knowledge, know-how, training that we provide them. All of that is really important. Even for transnational education programs, many of those programs have transcription routes where a student want to come here for half of their degree or for some part of their degree, and making all those transitions easier across the globe, not just with one country. It's really important for UK's higher education framework.
Thanks. Luke, did you want to come in?
Yes, I think first of all to link this to the earlier topics. I mean, one of the reasons for our scientific strength is that for a very long time we have had an open system, more open than most other countries. Partly that's a side benefit of our language. It's easy for people to come from the rest of the world and work here, and indeed the culture, the fact that we have autonomous and flexible universities, so people aren't having to fit into complicated civil service structures as they do in many countries. All of these things have meant that we have benefited, and we see that in the highly internationalized staff that we have working in our research system. Now, there have been some setbacks on that in recent years, which I won't go into now, but I think we do have to remember it. And indeed, our large numbers of international students also frequently remain for some time or permanently, and strengthen our system as well. We could go off into all kinds of side debates. The fact that our research funding system is dependent on an effective cross-subsidy from international students is not the healthiest situation, but the answer to that is for our government to fund research to a higher degree than it does, not to worry about the benefit of the people who come.
Thank you. Thank you. Simon, please come in.
Yeah, so I mean, to get the number of people in, to get the best people, talent from around the world, I mean, obviously we have these regulatory environment issues that we have to get around with, things like immigration. And unfortunately, that's not where I have a huge amount of expertise. But what we need to do at the beginning of this is to give people a stable career within research. And this is an area that I'm very interested in. So if you come in as an early career researcher, you are working in a very harsh environment, huge workloads. It's very difficult to plan out your career, and you take a lot of it on trust. I've worked with a number of people who were working from one short-term, 6-month, 1-year contract to the next. If we really expect people to come from around the world, I mean, obviously we've got this sort of superstar talent that we're trying to get to, global talent visas and all that sort of stuff. But we also need to be bringing in the people who are going to be the next generation of superstars. And if we can't provide them with a sustainable, supported role within research when they start their careers, it will not work.
Yeah, and Simon, I think one of the things Times Higher Education is looking to get more involved in terms of supporting the debates and promoting the debates is this Room for Talent initiative in the Netherlands. I was talking to the Vice Chancellor of Leeds University yesterday, and obviously she's sort of pivoting Leeds towards on paper anyway, much more supportive and compassionate place, and that looks at reevaluating how we assess careers, how we provide stability for early career researchers. I think that's absolutely right. As we've seen through the industrial action this week, there's a huge, increasingly hostile divide, I think, between some of the grassroots workers and the top, and I think we need to look at how do we nurture and support those early career researchers through more security and perhaps a different way of evaluating their success. That's a slightly separate conversation, but we're very keen to have that conversation and support those debates. Dave, we're into the last 6 minutes, so you might be the finale.
I'll rattle along. Yeah, two quick things. So one is that I think people tend to forget that basically I'm in favor of as much international flow as we possibly can on the student base. 2 reasons. One is science-based depends on it. An example would be AI. I can guarantee if I walk into any significant AI conference anywhere in the world, I will find people who have been supervised by people at Edinburgh University. It's like a mafia. And this is very important because it means that you have people who are your colleagues in every university in the world that you care about. It's a huge legacy of the UK, and we forget about it. So that's point number 1. Point number 2 is that there's a very benevolent cycle. You bring in people internationally, you train them up, they go out into the world, and then if you're very lucky, they become very clever and come back. A concrete example is Huawei, actually. That's a good one, setting up a lab in Edinburgh with brilliant people that they're bringing in because they believe they're excellent. Quite a lot of them were people who came in internationally, were trained in Edinburgh, actually went off and worked for big international companies, not Huawei. And now we're back in our sphere and working with us on an industrial basis. And the loop closes. And it's that sort of synergy that you're really looking for in all of this. And what we don't want to have is those sort of benevolent cycles being broken inadvertently. I don't think anybody really means to break these cycles, but it has been happening to some extent. And so we do have ground to cover, I think.
Absolutely, absolutely. I think it's probably time to wrap up a bit, and if anyone wants to come in, there's probably a final chance, and then I'll invite Michael just to sort of draw things to a head with some final thoughts from the industry perspective. Anyone want to jump in before then, just for a minute or two? All good. Michael, we have about 3 minutes. I know it's not an extremely hard deadline, but do you want to sort of just provide some final thoughts really about, and also suggestions how we take these conversations forward as well?
Yeah, thanks, Phil. I first want to reflect on the thing that Dave was just saying about the mobility of people, and that's so important, especially to keep some kind of mobility happening in the post-Brexit world. But one aspect which I think Mohammed also mentioned, and I think is often unspoken, is we not just here in the UK bring in people from around the world and act as some kind of science melting pot, and then they disappear to wherever, but we sometimes, I think, miss the opportunity to send our own home students overseas to broaden their horizons and make them more accepting of different ways of working. But to wrap up this conversation this morning, I think, well, yeah, the UK certainly has been a science superpower for many, many decades. If I took a harsh and critical analytical look at your charts, Phil, my impression is that we kind of did this, and we have probably dropped down a bit in the relative rankings, largely due to the ascendancy of other places in the world over the last maybe 5-8 years, something like that. So a crude way of counting that is to say how many UK universities in your top 100 or 200 global. That number has gone down a little bit in the last few years. What's the right number is a question I haven't heard anyone ask. And of course, if I spoke to individual vice chancellors, they say, well, I want to be back in that group. No one wants to be number 101 and therefore off someone's radar. But I think managing how we look attractive and maintain confidence, clarity breeds confidence, visibility can lead to attractiveness. If we don't have clarity, if we don't have visibility, then we make life hard for ourselves. So I want to see some good, strong, positive messages come out that say, yeah, we've changed the rules of the game, play on.
Excellent. Well, that's a fantastic place to end. And I think that for me, it's really about, as I say, keep talking about this, keep raising the challenges, keep celebrating what works brilliantly about the UK sector. You know, as Dave, you very, very wonderfully articulated, and that we are excellent because of that absolute approach to being internationally collaborative and sharing and having the best of the world coming to us and working with us and sharing with us. So celebrating that, but also making sure we talk about the risks to that as well, a really important part of the conversation. So just nothing more to say other than a huge thank you for everyone's contributions. We really appreciate how candid you were, appreciate you giving your time. As I say, we will write up some of this in Times Higher, and obviously I'm really keen to make sure we keep these conversations and have them also in a more public way. So we've got all sorts of events coming across the rest of the year. Digital Universities Week in March in London. We'll be in Manchester, I think, for the annual academic salon. So we'll be able to talk a bit more about leveling up and talk a bit more about the making sure the North is properly recognized in terms of the distribution of R&D funding. So lots more contact points, lots more opportunities. But for now, a huge thank you for your time and engagement and your candid thoughts. Really appreciate it.